This is Scott the Fix-It Guy. Today we're dealing with an LG washing machine with an FE error, and it's not letting in enough water. So we're going to be replacing the cold water fill valve. Here's the little part number for the fill valve. We got it through Amazon. You could replace the hot water fill valve at the same time, but this video will be just the cold water side. So we're going to turn off the water supply for hot and cold coming to the machine. We're going to unplug it, and then what we'll do first is remove the top panel. So the top panel is just held on by two Phillips head screws. When you look at the back, you'll see two brackets, and there's a Phillips head screw on the top and at the bottom. You want to remove the bottom one, and that's on the right and left side. We're also going to be spinning off the fill valve, or the fill hose on the right side. That's for the cold water. Just use a pair of pliers to spin that off. And you can pull the washer away from the wall so it's easier to get to this Phillips head screw. I'm using a little tool that just kind of like a differential. It switches 90 degrees to get into tight spaces. But once you get the two screws off, you want to push the top panel back away from you by about 3 inches. Sometimes it's kind of stubborn. You have to give it a lot of force to get it to move. But then you can just pull it straight off. And then the fill valve assembly is sitting right there. I'm going to take a picture of how the wires are connected and how the hoses are connected to help me remember. On the hot side, the red one here, it's very simple, but on the cold side, there's 4 valves you have to contend with and four hoses. And I notice also on the hot side, which is actually working, it looks kind of rusted. So I think that's something we'll have to replace pretty soon. But once I got the picture taken, I'll remove the electrical modular connectors from each one of the valve coils, and then I'm going to use a pair of pliers to loosen up the spring clamps that are on these 4 hoses, and I'll move them back by about an inch. And then what I'll do is I'll grab the new valve and I'll take one hose off the old valve, and then I'll put it on the new valve one at a time, just so I don't get the hoses mixed up. Each one of these valves lets in cold water for different reasons. Part of it for filling, part of it for rinse, part of it for when the bleach is added. So we don't want to really get these mixed up. So now we've got the hoses on, and I'm going to remove 2 Phillips head screws that are holding on the old valve, and they are located on the back side of the washing machine, just right behind the valve assembly. Pretty easy to just spin them off. Making sure I got all the hoses on correctly. Use my little angle tool to get to those 2 screws, zip those off. And once I get those off, I can just pull the old valve assembly out. Usually one of the coils that creates a magnetic field gets kind of weak, and it doesn't let enough water come in. The computer thinks that a certain amount of water should come in a certain amount of time, and if it doesn't, it'll create the FE error. So I'm putting the new valve into position, and then I'll just add those 2 little screws to hold it on. Pretty quick and easy procedure. And again, the hot side's even easier because it's just one valve and one hose. I've seen a few times where these LG fill valves, either the hot or the cold, will develop a little dribble, a little leak at the top. And I think that's what happened to the hot side. That's why it's rusted. But it's actually working during the test phase. So we'll probably replace it later. So I'm just adding those screws in to hold on the cold side fill valve. There we go, and then we're just going to add the spring clamps back on to the hoses. So the hoses are already on, but we want to get the spring clamps back into position. We're going to put the fill hose back in for the cold side. We're going to very carefully put it on by hand. You want to make sure it goes on really easily for about maybe 6 turns. And then you can use some pliers to get it tighter. If it doesn't go on easily initially, then it's cross-threaded, and if you drive it on with a pair of pliers, it'll mess up the plastic thread. So make sure, again, it goes on very easily by hand first, about 6 turns, and then you can use the pliers to get it a little tighter. So those are just the spring clamps that hold on the hoses. Make sure you get them nice and tight, and you want to push them in toward the valve so they're maybe 1/8 of an inch away from the valve for each hose. So we're just putting the little modular connectors on. Make sure they're on as far on as they can go. And once we get them on, we can turn the water back on, plug it in, and just make sure that it's going to work. It's going to let water come in and not get the FE error. Sometimes too, the water that comes from the wall, from the house, it will bring sediment with it, and it'll clog a little filter that's behind the cold side fill valve. And just cleaning the filter may allow then for enough water to come in where you get rid of the FE error. It's a little less common, but it's a good thing to check. And the way you do that is you remove the fill hose in the back, and then you just visually inspect what that filter looks like to see if there's any crud on it. I'm putting the top back on, so I slide it on and I push it in from the back, and then I'll add those 2 little screws that hold it on, Phillips head screws. There we go. I'm just looking at the filter on this one. It looks good. So it wasn't a clogged filter. It's just the fill valve was no longer working too well. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope you get a chance to subscribe to our channel when you can. Thanks again for watching.